Hi, this is Christopher Dragon, Music Director of Your Wyoming Symphony Orchestra. Our upcoming concert, Band Symphonica, is based around the maverick Friedrich Gulda, an Austrian pianist and composer who worked in both classical and jazz. Gulda was lauded for his interpretations of Bach and Mozart, hence why we are opening our concert with two works by these composers. Johann Sebastian Bach is one of the great composers. For me, growing up and studying music at university, it was always said that there is no such thing as bad music by Bach. Looking back now, I find this is very interesting, as Bach's 1,000+ works enjoyed relatively little appreciation during his lifetime. By the 1840s, he was largely forgotten, but Felix Mendelssohn revived Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and from there musicians steadily rediscovered his extraordinary body of work. Today he is regarded as one of the great composers, with many known works like the Well-Tempered Clavier, Brandenburg Concertos, and his Toccata and Fugue in D minor, of which we will be performing a very different rendition of. Bach's Toccata and Fugue was originally composed for the organ. Actually, at the time, Bach's main reputation was not as a composer, but as an astoundingly gifted organist and improviser. So it comes to no surprise that he composed many pieces for this instrument. Now, whether you are familiar with Bach's music or not, it's highly likely that you would have heard of this piece before, or at least the opening. And there you go, every cartoon, Halloween episode and scary music from TV in the past 80 years. This connection between the music and evoking a sense of fear and dread wasn't the original intention behind the piece, but it slowly developed this link through the use in film and television. The piece is broken into two main sections. The first being a toccata, which is a type of music usually written for keyboard that shows off the performer's touch and technique. It begins with a flourish in the upper register, moving down into the depths in a kind of free form, giving the possibility for much personal expression. Next follows numerous fast arpeggiated sections. These are the notes of a chord played in a series rather than simultaneously, and scalic passages showing off the virtuosity of the performer. Next comes a strong contrast of ideas, a dainty, twirling passage against a stern, forceful reply, which I think is made most clear in Stokowski's orchestration of the work. Side note, this rendition was also a feature of the 1946 re-release of Fantasia. More virtuosity follows, ending once again in the depths, setting the stage for the second half of this piece, the fugue. Bach excelled at this glorious but fiendishly difficult musical form. A fugue, I guess you can say, is kind of a musical chase between two or more lines. The first line starts, then a second line joins in slightly higher or lower than the first, but otherwise almost identical. A third or fourth line may join. The skill of a fugal composer is to make these lines develop independently and yet still fit together. Here is the main theme of which this fugue is built upon. For our concert, you will hear this piece arranged for brass quintet. Now, you might think that this is odd to adapt a piece originally for organ to brass instruments, but actually I find that this works very well. Although an organ is a keyboard instrument, its sound is produced by air through pipes. So it's no surprise that there are some similarities in sound quality to brass instruments. Because Baroque music is full of all these complex lines, this arrangement for brass quintet makes it a little bit easier to follow, especially visually, split between the two trumpets, French horn, trombone, and tuba. This piece will showcase the virtuosity of our brass musicians and will make you question how this piece was originally written for a single instrument, the organ. Next on our program is another one of the all-time great composers, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and one that you're probably very familiar with if you tuned in to our Totally Mozart concert last January. For those of you that may have missed out, Mozart was a child prodigy born in Austria. He began composing at the age of 4, wrote his first symphony at the age of 8, his first opera at 11, and amassed an impressive output of over 600 pieces by his untimely death at the age of just 35. Even in this short time, Mozart became one of the pillars of the classical period. At the time he began composing, European music was dominated by the Galant style, a reaction against the highly evolved Baroque music, which you will hear in Bach's Toccata and Fugue. This resulted in singable melodies and highly structured, balanced music. Like in our Totally Mozart concert, we will be performing another one of Mozart's serenades composed for winds, his Serenade number 11 in E-flat. Now, a serenade is a light-hearted genre often used as dinner music to be performed at parties, and so was composed purely for entertainment. The serenade we are about to play for you tonight was so popular at its premiere that its musicians were whisked away to 2 more parties that night to perform the piece. Unlike the Big Wind Symphony that we played in our last concert, which had 7 movements, this serenade only has 5. The first movement begins with solemn repeated chords, which serve as architectural pillars, signifying each section throughout the movement. What follows is a melody that skips along in the clarinet with interjections by the bassoons, as if wanting to join in, until the whole ensemble bursts open with rollicking joy. It's not all fun and games. We later hear a contrasting, pleading lyrical theme which eventually loses steam, requiring a bustling energy of notes to get the movement going again. Virtuosic pairs of instruments follow, bringing us back to our architectural pillar chords, leading us to the development section where the previous ideas are explored further. This, however, does not last long, as our pillar chords soon return, bringing us to the recapitulation, which is basically a recap of all the material we first heard. One interesting change in this section is that instead of arriving at the contrasting, pleading lyrical theme, we now have a jaunty kind of hunting melody found in the French horn. The second movement is a minuet and trio, a form in 3/4 meter, meaning 3 beats in a bar, often having a kind of dance character to it. This minuet begins quite grand in character in a somewhat regal manner. The trio section begins hesitantly with the horns, as if trying to search for something until they reach the second half of this trio, which in contrast is warm and lyrical, making it clear they have found their destination. As is the standard structure of this form, at the end of the trio section, we repeat back to the grand material of the minuet, creating a kind of musical sandwich. The third movement is an intimate, deeply expressive adagio, which leaves behind the world of festive public serenades for the personal poise of the opera stage. Here, Mozart produces an adagio quartet of operatic dimensions, with the oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and horn stepping forward into the spotlight. The fourth movement is another minuet and trio. However, this one is very different in character, overflowing with hearty folk song melodies. The minuet is based around call and response, at first introduced by the clarinet, then answered by the entire ensemble. The trio section for me is a little bit more rustic and dug in. Keep an ear out for the second bassoon, which is primarily the bass of this ensemble, creating a kind of folk-like dance. The work finishes with a light-hearted, rollicking finale, despite the fugue-like section that makes an appearance in the middle of the piece. Thankfully, this seriousness doesn't last very long, as a competition of virtuosity soon breaks out between the instruments. As you can hear, it is a movement full of Mozart's characteristic charm and humour. As I mentioned earlier, Friedrich Gulda was a maverick, openly flaunting classical music etiquette and conventions, so much so that he even played some recitals in the nude. Don't worry, thankfully this won't be happening at our concert. This defiance was also present in his everyday life, as he even faked his own death just to see what kind of obituaries would be written about him. As you can probably guess, this character is translated throughout his compositions. His cello concerto exemplifies his blurring of boundaries between musical genres, and I think shows why Gulda was considered the crossover pioneer. You can tell instantly from the makeup of the ensemble, which includes a jazz rhythm section, guitar, bass, and drum set, instruments you do not often see in classical music. The concerto begins with an overture. This is an orchestral introduction, a piece of music that you will usually hear at the beginning of an opera or ballet. Of course, it being Gulda, this is not your usual introduction. We are instantly transported into a kind of rock concert with riffing between the soloist and the orchestra. It continues with the soloist rocking out with the band, the bass, drums, and guitar. However, out of nowhere emerges a contrasting lyrical section. Gone is the grittiness, bite, and jazz rhythm section for a floating melody introduced by the woodwinds, sounding as if it has arrived from the Austrian mountainside. These two main ideas make up the entirety of the first movement. The second movement is an idyll, a term used in music to suggest a pastoral setting. In this case, we return back to the Austrian Alps. Melodious folk tunes are first sounded in the brass chorale and subsequently are taken over by the soloist. A landlord breaks the repose with oboes and clarinets yodeling up and down before the cello takes over, with the chorale eventually returning for the end. The third movement is the central point of this concerto and is entirely a cadenza, a solo moment which features just the soloist to show off their virtuosity and musical prowess. It consists of two improvised sections, the first one with wild double stops, and the second, according to Gulda, with lovingly whistling harmonics. Both contrast charmingly with thoughtful and hesitant monologues, as well as wild rhythmic memories of before. This cadenza links into the fourth movement, which has a stately character of a Renaissance courtly dance. In the middle of this movement, we find a very pleasant song-like section featuring the flute and guitar, interchanging moments with the soloist and oboe. We end with a rather mad marching band. The horns and trumpets are giving full license to raucously go all out, while the cello is playing notes flying out of all directions. At one point, things quieten down into repeated chords as if we are about to hear the toreadors straight out of Carmen. A passage follows that sounds like a mix of free jazz and a steam train. We even have a brief kind of trumpet mariachi moment. The whole thing is gloriously crazy and is just full of fun. It is clearly the character of Friedrich Gulda. Joining us for this wild piece is our first soloist of the season, the principal cellist of the Colorado Symphony, So Young Min. So that is a little bit about our Band Symphonica program. Thank you for joining us and for supporting your Wyoming Symphony Orchestra. I hope you enjoy exploring the music and character of the maverick, Friedrich Gulda.